We're so glad you're here, and we're really glad Evan Thomas is here. We're also really glad that his lovely wife, Osi, is here. As you read in the acknowledgments to the book, Osi was with Evan every step of the way in the research, in the writing. They are a wonderful partnership, and in fact, they met in law school at the University of Virginia Law School. So Evan was a top writer and editor at both Newsweek and Time, a presidential historian, written fantastic books on Eisenhower and Nixon. His next book is going to be on Truman and the A-bomb. He's written books about lawyers, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, as well as Edward Bennett Williams. Just a master historian. And this book, as well as many others, have been New York Times bestsellers. Please welcome Evan Thomas.
Thank you, Tim. My friend Talmage, I've done this a few times with him. I've loved it. Osi and I are really happy to be here in Dallas, and thank you to the Dallas Bar Foundation and to all of you in this room.
Well, for those of you who were generous enough to buy $5,000 tables, you have a copy of Evan's book on your seat. And for those of you who didn't, I'm sure Amazon or Barnes & Noble would love to sell you a copy. But we're talking tonight
and your neighbors, too.
Yeah, tell your friends, tell your neighbors. Christmas isn't far away. But we're here tonight really to talk about Evan's latest book, because we're all lawyers and many judges in the room. And this is really a historic book about a historic figure. So Evan, you're a graduate of law school, although you never practiced law. Your wife, an accomplished lawyer. You covered big legal affairs at Time and Newsweek. You've written books about lawyers. But with all that background in the law, what were the circumstances that led to your writing this biography of Sandra Day O'Connor?
Random House wanted Sandra O'Connor to write her memoir so they could make some money. Because they did make money off of her memoir of growing up on the Lazy Bee Ranch. So there was talk about her writing a memoir, and I was actually brought in to be maybe her ghostwriter. I spent a day with her, and I could tell that she didn't really want to do it. Yes, she wanted to be remembered. She wanted to have a book written, but she's really a very private person, and I don't really think she wanted to do it. Now, as it happened, she was getting Alzheimer's. She was getting dementia, early stages, but the family her family thought, well, let's try to do this as a biography. So I was brought in and given access to her papers and to her family, and we got her to write a letter to her colleagues on the court and to her law clerks. And Osi and I interviewed 7 justices and 94 law clerks, about 350 people all told, and had access to her papers. So we had a lot of access.
Well, one of the leading reviewers of your book in the New York Times Review of Books said, this is a book about a life, more than a book about a judge. And I'm sure you would agree with that. So what's more important in American history, the life journey of Sandra Day O'Connor or her impact as a justice on the United States Supreme Court?
Well, you can't separate them because her jurisprudence was informed by her life. The fact that she was the first woman was a relevant fact, as the lawyers would say, and she never denied that. She was not a feminist. She didn't call herself a feminist, but she was the most feminist unfeminist there ever was. And I mean, not just because she was the first, but she wrote the controlling law on abortion rights, and still the law of the land. That's her opinion. She, in smaller cases in other ways, she was a conservative, but when cases involving women and children, she was a liberal. And so you can see it in her law.
So we're going to cover both her life as well as her career in the Supreme Court. But let's start at the very beginning, her youth. Sandra Day grew up on a large cattle ranch on the border of New Mexico and Arizona called the Lazy Bee, and it was owned and run by her father, who began teaching his daughter to be a self-reliant adult before she was a teenager. And your book makes clear that he probably shaped her life more than any other person throughout the course of her life. So explain the dynamics of that father-daughter relationship.
Well, she worshiped him, but she liked to tell this story to her law clerks that when she was a 15-year-old girl, her job was to make lunch for the Roundup. Roundup would happen miles away on the prairie. There's a 160,000-acre ranch. And so she would get up at 5 a.m. and cook the roast and cook the cake and load the truck. And on her way out to the Roundup one day, she had a flat tire. And she's a slight girl, so she had to jump on the jack to change the tire. It took her an hour. She got there, and her father looked at her and said, "You're late." And she said, "Well, Dad, I had to change a tire." And he said, "Next time, leave earlier." She told that story to her law clerks. And yes, she learned self-reliance. But actually, I know the book makes a lot out of his shaping influence on her, but really, I think her mother had a greater impact on her in this way, in a more subtle way, but in an important way. Her mother was a very elegant woman on this dusty ranch. No electricity, no running water when she was first born. But Mrs. Day always wore a dress, perfume, hose, good shoes, and she had an elegant, reserved manner. And Sandra learned a lot at night watching Mr. Day and Mrs. Day. Mr. Day was a great guy, but he could be a bully. And he could have a drink or two in the evening and start in on Edna May. And Sandra watched because her mother was not passive. She didn't roll over. She wasn't cowed. But she also knew when not to get into a stupid fight, to when not to take the bait, to when to pick her shots. This was an incredibly important lesson for Sandra Day O'Connor, who spent her lifetime dealing with obnoxious men.
So after a childhood and adolescence with this strong mother and this the strong father and quietly strong mother, at age 16, she goes to college. She goes to Stanford. And Stanford really opened her eyes far beyond anything she'd experienced in middle school or high school. So what were the main intellectual sparks that began flying around inside Sandra Day once she started college?
Well, a couple of things. She took a course called Western Civilization, Western Civ, which was just as it says about Western civilization, required of all first-year students then. They don't teach it anymore. It's regarded as being too patriarchal and too hegemonic, so they abolished the course. But for her, it was everything. Osi and I read her final exam, written as a 17-year-old girl. It is a brilliant exegesis on Madison and Jefferson and the rule of law. You can see the judge she became in the exam paper she wrote when she was 17.
So after graduating from Stanford, she enters law school at age 19. And one of the first things that happened was she met the smartest guy in the law school, a fellow by the name of William Rehnquist. So what kind of relationship did she have with her law school classmate during law school and then afterwards with her future Supreme Court colleague?
Well, the story they always told was they went to a couple of movies. The facts were a little different. They went out freshman year, and she actually took him to the ranch, took Bill, her friend Bill, to the ranch, and Mr. Day, when he greeted Bill Rehnquist by giving him a roasted bull's testicle to eat. And I don't think that Bill did all that well at the ranch, actually, because they broke up shortly thereafter. But when Bill was a third-year student, first in his class, he left law school early to be a Supreme Court clerk for Justice Jackson. And he moved to Washington, and he decided that he missed Sandra and started writing her letters. Well, Osi and I found out about this a little indirectly. We had access to her papers, and we were looking for love letters between Sandra and John, her husband of 45 years. We knew it was a great love story. Where are the love letters? Couldn't find any in her papers at the Library of Congress. So we were in her chambers at the Supreme Court, and her longtime secretary, Linda Neary, took us down to a storage locker in the basement, and there was a box marked correspondence, and we said, "Can we look in there?" Family said, "Okay." And there were a lot of love letters between John and Sandra. There were. There were also 14 love letters from Bill Rehnquist to Sandra Day. Letter number 7 said, "Will you marry me, Sandy?" They never told anybody. They didn't even tell their own family about this. The answer was no. She strung him along for a couple of months because she was waiting for John to ask. But this is 1952, before sex, so they hadn't slept together. And they actually became very good friends, very, very good friends for the rest of their lives.
Well, Sandra went on to graduate in the top 10% of her class in 1952, but during that third year, while all the men were interviewing, no one would interview her. None of the law firms who came to Stanford would interview her. So describe how that setback impacted her.
Well, she applied to 40 law firms. If you had a B+ average, you could apply. And she was top order of the coif, top 10%, law review. She gets one interview. They ask her at Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher, and they ask her, how well do you type? Actually, her answer was so-so. Flash forward 30 years. Sandra Day O'Connor is now a Arizona Court of Appeals judge. Calling her on the phone is William French Smith, who had been a partner at Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher, now is the Attorney General of the United States, calling her to ask her to come to Washington to interview the President of the United States about being a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. And she gets on the phone and says, you wouldn't be calling me about secretarial work, would you? But the way it affected her, I mean, she liked to joke, she liked to tell that story and have a little fun with it. But more interestingly, she was never bitter. She just went to the public sector. And she went to the local DA and said, I'd like to work for you. And he said, I don't have any money. She said, I'll work for free. She said, I'll work for free. He said, well, I don't have any space for you. She said, I'll work off of your secretary's desk. And she did. And finally, he hired her and paid her. But that was typical of her. Don't complain, move on.
Mm-hmm. Now, after law school, she immediately married John O'Connor, her law school colleague on the Law Review. And in no time at all, they had 3 sons. And so therein began the lifelong challenge of finding work-life balance. And I'm sure many women and some men in this audience have faced that challenge. She often said, quote, always put your family first, though this often caused her to live life at a very frenetic pace. So knowing that that was her goal, did she succeed over the course of this amazing life of always being able to put her family first?
Yes. I mean, obviously she made mistakes along the way, and she'd be the first to admit that. Nobody's going to be perfect. She was a realist and a pragmatist, and she understood that, yes, you do have to make sacrifices. Her point when she said, put your family first, it was sort of an obvious point. Be smart about it. You know, don't get so consumed by your job that you can't see your family. But she was pretty consumed by her job, and her son Scott said she had 3 boys, successful kids who grew into successful men. But Scott said there were 3 rules in the house. First rule was be home by 6. The second rule was do not speak ill of others. And the third rule was don't hit your brother. Those were the rules.
So she gets married, she has a family, and they live in Phoenix. And in no time at all, she starts taking off and being a high achiever on multiple fronts. She goes from being a practicing lawyer to president of the Junior League, to assistant state attorney general, to state majority leader in the state Senate, to trial judge, and finally to appellate justice. And you say in the midst of that amazing rise, her ambition was, quote, palpable. She believed larger stages beckoned. And she had a sense, quote, she was destined for more than wealth and social success, and that she believed she had the power to influence her own destiny. So during those years in Phoenix, is it accurate to say she truly thought she was indomitable?
Yes, I mean, she had the kind of self-confidence that is just one in a million. You know, people just aren't like that. But she had the self-confidence, the best kind of self-confidence, the confidence to be humble. She was actually although she had a huge ego and a great intelligence and a great power, she knew how to be humble. She knew when not to show off and when not to pick a fight. and one not to strut. She was, you might say that she's the opposite of some current politicians, but actually the opposite of a lot of politicians. She had a kind of quiet, self-controlled confidence that allowed her to be humble.
Now, you mentioned a couple of minutes ago that, in fact, she was a, quote, cautious crusader for women. Although in state politics and on the state and then on the Supreme Court, she was never a militant feminist. But you to call her a cautious crusader, she, quote, slowly gained ground for women. In her own way, she became a champion for women's rights. So because of her unmilitant approach, will she ever get credit for what she did for her gender?
Well, no, and I'll tell you a story that's revealing of this. You remember the Equal Rights Amendment was actually, believe it or not, in the late 60s, it was non-controversial. It was on the Republican and Democratic platforms. But every revolution creates a counter-revolution. And Women's Lib, as it was called then, in the late 60s, helped produce Phyllis Schlafly. Remember Phyllis Schlafly? She was a powerful political force. And she arrived in Arizona just as the Equal Rights Amendment had passed Congress and was now being ratified by the states. It had already been ratified by about 30 states. Phyllis Schlafly arrives in town and does a brilliant job saying it's a terrible idea that women will be drafted, that it will screw up family life. And the counter reaction had really started to set in. So where does this leave Justice O'Connor, then Senator O'Connor? She is a Senate Majority Leader. She introduced the Equal Rights Amendment on the floor of the Arizona Senate, and then she let it die in committee. And the feminists were furious at her as a traitor. You sold us out. They were whispering that she had sold it out for a federal judgeship from Barry Goldwater. There actually is a little correspondence with Barry Goldwater, but that's not why she did it. She did it, she let it die in committee because she knew it couldn't pass. She didn't have the votes. Why waste your time? Instead, what she did, she made a list, and OC and I have read the list. She made a list of every law in the state of Arizona that discriminated against women, and there were a lot of them. You couldn't get a bank loan, you couldn't get a credit card, you couldn't own property without your husband's permission. She made it her business to change every single one of those laws, and she did, one by one. And she didn't get any credit for this. She did it below the radar screen. It wasn't a big deal. Nobody even really noticed, but she did. The point is, be pragmatic, be effective. Don't score virtue signaling points by making a big losing battle for the RA. Quietly change the laws that you can change.
Now, after she became a United States Supreme Court justice, the question always rose, well, how is it different for a woman compared to a man justice? And she often said, quote, a wise old man and a wise old woman reach the same conclusion, close quote. But you say in the book that she brought, quote, a uniquely feminine perspective to her Supreme Court opinions. So how did she do that?
Well, it's subtle, but when she's ruling on abortion, she's the only one who's ever had a fetus in her. And actually, her daughter-in-law was pregnant at the time of one of the big abortion cases, and it, as her husband allowed in the die, it affected her judgment. I mean, her personal experience of having been a mother did affect her judgment. Abortion for her was personally not something that she would do, or she said that, but she wasn't going to take away that right from other women, and she became the compromise vote here. Now, the way she did this, I'm going to take a little time to tell this story because it's so revealing of how she did her business. When she came on the court, she's a Reagan appointee. She's a conservative. And Harry Blackmun, who wrote Roe v. Wade, the abortion decision in 1970, he thinks, oh my God, she's going to vote to overturn Roe. And he doesn't like her. And in the first few abortion decisions in the 80s, a little bit hard to tell exactly where she's coming out. She ducked the question in her confirmation hearing. But by 1989, she has figured out where she's coming out, which is a compromise, basically to say that states could put some restraints on abortion, but they could not put a, quote, undue burden on a woman's right to abortion. She's the one who arrived at that standard. But it's not enough to come up with the standard. By 1992, the Casey case has come up to the Supreme Court. And by now there are 5 justices who vote in vote in conference, in the Supreme Court's private conference, to gut Roe v. Wade. So Rehnquist thinks he's got the votes, no more Roe v. Wade. One of them is Justice Kennedy. Justice Kennedy is the newest justice, and he has been an ally and pal of Justice Scalia. They're both Roman Catholic, they're both pretty conservative, and it looks like Kennedy is following Scalia's lead. In fact, the clerks are joking that Kennedy's nickname is Little Nini because he's slavish in his devotion. Justice O'Connor has great human intelligence, and she watches this dance, and she can see that actually Justice Scalia is a little patronizing and condescending. He had suffered from that. He was a great life force on the court. He enlivened it, but he treated the other justices like had to be the smartest kid in the class. The class in this case is the Supreme Court conference room. And he's lecturing them he's sending them ninograms about their spelling and their grammar. And Justice O'Connor sees that Justice Kennedy actually resents this. So she forms a little private, when the Casey comes up, she creates this little private cabal called the Troika, her and Justice Souter, who is also her pal, and they peel Kennedy away from the majority, and he becomes the 5th vote to preserve Roe v. Wade. Justice Scalia is furious at this, and this is all the very good fingertips of Justice O'Connor, reading Justice Kennedy, being respectful to him. One thing she did was she let him basically write the opinion. Justice Kennedy was a flamboyant, flowery writer. He loved to turn phrases. Justice O'Connor hated that stuff. Her opinions were dull, brief, to the point, fact-based. But if you read the Casey case, the start of it is all very grandiose. She let Kennedy write all that stuff. She wrote the nuts and bolts at the end of the opinion, the stuff that mattered. But she let Kennedy clear his throat for the first, 20 paragraphs.
Now, besides abortion, another major issue that kept coming up frequently was affirmative action. And she saw, most people see affirmative action as one way or another. Conservatives, it needs to end. Liberals, no, it needs to be preserved, black or white. And she saw it as gray. You say in the book she was, quote, an incrementalist and a minimalist. She didn't like affirmative action, but she saved it. And you say she occupied a lonely no man's land between the conservatives who wanted to end it and the liberals who wanted to preserve it. And yet, having said all that, you conclude that affirmative action defined her role on the court. How so?
Well, she knew she was in a tough spot because, as Talmage says, generally the liberals wanted to preserve affirmative action, racial preference, and the conservatives said, no, the Constitution's colorblind, no racial preference. She was in the middle. On some cases, she ruled against on set-asides for minority contracts in the city of Richmond, Croson case. She writes from the majority against that, knocking it down. She does the same thing in the federal level in Adirondack. But she always, when she applies, for you lawyers, when she applies strict scrutiny to racial preference, it's not, as they say, fatal in fact. She always leaves the door open. And that's an important thing because when affirmative action in higher education, University of Michigan and Michigan Law School is tested in 2002, and the Grutter Gutter and help me. What was it? Gratz. Gutter and Gratz were the 2 cases. She's the 5th vote. I should say, in 24 years, she was the decisive vote 330 times. That's a lot of power.
That's why they called it the O'Connor Court.
In this case, this facts are kind of perfect for her. In the college, they do racial preference by the numbers, and the court deciding, she included, says that's out. It's too much like a quota. But at law school, it's more holistic. Race can be a factor, but it's not quite clear how much of a factor, and that's like the Bakke case. That's where she ends up. And she was very influenced by real world consequences. She really cared about how decisions played in the real world. And two things really affected her. One was that the state of California had done a referendum on affirmative action and knocked it out in the 90s. And the number of African Americans at Berkeley and UCLA went from about 10% to less than 1% in 1 year. And she believed law schools are training grounds for leaders, that 1 out of 4 US senators is a lawyer. And she said you just can't have law schools have so few minorities. You can't do it. She was also really influenced by a brief from former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who said in the military, we do affirmative action all the time. We have to, we want to, we do it because the officer corps has got to look like America. And she was very influenced by those real world practical briefs. And so she said that yes, you can still have racial preference in higher education. She put a sort of a time limit on it. She said, hopefully in 25 years we won't need it. This got her a lot of heat in the law reviews. In fact, Justice Thomas said, wait a second, if it's unconstitutional 25 years from now, why isn't it unconstitutional now? She got into trouble with the doctrinally pure, but she was just practical about it. I asked her a few years ago, and she said, well, maybe I was wrong about the 25 years. But the point is she's trying to find a middle way here. And she's doing it a little bit by the seat of her pants, but it's very pragmatic. And she's very sensitive that the court, and people think of the court as being the last word. No, actually not for her. The court, she saw the Supreme Court as in a conversation with other branches of government. And that meant that she was always writing these narrow opinions, sending things back down to the lower courts, or back to the state legislature, or back to Congress. She believed that the law, particularly in sensitive areas like abortion and affirmative action, that the law should move slowly and incrementally, never get too far out from where the people are. In abortion, she didn't have to read the polls to know that a third of Americans are against affirmative action no matter what, a third are for it no matter what, and a third are somewhere in the middle. That's about where she was, and that's about where she kept the Supreme Court.
Now, obviously, a lot of important cases on abortion and affirmative action, but probably the most important case of her entire 24 years on the Supreme Court was the case of Bush versus Gore. And you devote a chapter to it in the book. And because it was such an impactful decision, but also because it gave her such major heartburn. So why did Bush versus Gore knock Sandra Day O'Connor out of equilibrium?
Well, it was a tough case. But just to remind you all, 2000 election is virtually a tie. But in the state of Florida, it looks like Bush is ahead by 500 votes, and the Florida Secretary of State, Katherine Harris, certifies electors for Bush. Well, Gore sues. Remember the hanging chads? And there's a recount starts. He wins in the state courts. It gets to the Supreme Court. And the question is, should the Supreme Court allow the recount to go on? And the Supreme Court says no in Bush v. Gore by a 5-4 vote. Now, the 5 are all conservative Republicans allowing Bush to win, and the 4 who want to allow the recount to continue, favoring Gore presumably, are liberal Democrats. So it looks nakedly political. It just looks like it's just raw politics. Conservatives on one side, liberals on the other, makes the Supreme Court look like a political institution. Now, Justice O'Connor was a Republican. She had been, an early member of the Young Republicans of Maricopa County. She was a Republican majority leader. She was a Republican. She liked the Bushes. She liked George Bush. But that's not why she voted that way. Here's why she voted that way. Interestingly, Osi and I were told about this first by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was on the other side. Justice O'Connor always, I mentioned earlier, she very much cared about the consequences, the practical consequences of a case. In fact, Bill Webster called her a consequentialist. So she's looking down the road. What happens if the recount continues? Well, if the recount continues, it might the electors might end up for Gore. you now have two sets of electors, because there's already been a group certified, a Bush group and a Gore group. There's actually a law for what happens next. It's 3 U.S. Code 15. If there are two sets of electors, it goes to Congress. The House has one vote, and the Senate has one vote. The House was going to be Republican, the Senate was going to be Democratic. Under the law, if there's a tie, the tie is broken by the governor of the state. His name was Jeb Bush. She's thinking, you know, in January we're going to look like a banana republic. The guy's brother election. So she said, we're going to get this over with now. And that was really driving her train. Now, the opinion that she and Kennedy, again, drafted has come in for a lot of heat. And interestingly, she was a woman essentially of no regrets, but she did have some regrets about this one. It made the court look terrible. And the opinion was bad law. And she, although was somebody would say, move on, get over it, a couple of things. One is she always said, you know, she liked to say that media organizations did a recount. People forget this. They actually did it. They actually took the ballots and did $1 million project. The New York Times, the Florida papers, the Washington Post paid to do a recount of the actual ballots. And you know what? Bush actually won. Gore did not win. Bush won. So she would say, hey, Bush won anyway. But more movingly to me, a couple of things. In 2012, I think it was, she told the Chicago Tribune editorial board that she thought maybe the court should not have taken the case, that they should have let it rattle along on the lower courts. Very unusual for her to admit any regret. She was in the very earliest stage of Alzheimer's, and I think possibly that loosened her lips a little bit. I asked her, I said, do you have any regrets? She said, I do have regrets about it, but regrets don't do you any good.
Let's talk, other than the most important cases, kind of about the dynamics of being a Supreme Court justice, which is really one of the most fun parts of the book. You say that when Sandra Day O'Connor joined the Supreme Court in 1981, you said it was, quote, a secret, cloistered world where justices rarely spoke to each other outside of conference, and there were spiteful personal feuds. But then over time, she changed all that. So what exactly did she do over the course of 24 years to kind of break down these cloistered walls?
Well, the simplest thing she did was to make him go to lunch. It sounds like a small thing, but it's not. When she arrived at the Supreme Court, at her very first lunch at the Supreme Court, only 4 other justices showed up out of 8. They were distrustful of each other. Remember the book, The Brethren, by Armstrong, Woodward and Armstrong? That had come out the year before, and the justices weren't sure who the leaker was, or the leakers, plural. And so they were older, and they were distrustful, and she was really bothered by this. So she made it her business to get justices to go to lunch. Justice Sotomayor told Ossie and me that she would just come, if you weren't going to lunch, she'd come in your chambers and just sit there until you came to lunch. And Justice Thomas told me this story. He said when he first came on the court, you remember his hearings were very tough. The Anita Hill charges were really rough. And he told me this story. He said, when I came on the court, I felt hammered. That was the word he used, hammered by it, and lonely. And after my first conference, I was walking back to my chambers alone, and she walked with me. And after a while, she said, you know, those hearings were very damaging. And he didn't know what to say. Damaging to him personally, yes. Damaging to the court, yes. Damaging to the country, yes. So he didn't say anything. And she didn't. But the next day, she walked with him again. And the day after that, and the day after that. And she started saying, you know, Clarence, you should come to lunch. Finally, she said, Clarence, you got to come to lunch. And he said, yes, ma'am. And he did. And he said, it changed everything for me. He went from being this kind of lonely outsider sulking in his tent to part of the group. Clarence Thomas, for those of you who know him, and some of you probably do, has a big personality. He's funny, he's charming, he's got a big laugh. He joined the group, and he said to me, she was the glue. The court wasn't so happy before she got on the court, not so happy right now. But in the 90s, especially, she was the one who made this place civil. She really cared about that.
Well, along those lines, to fill her role. And you say she was the justice who kept the court centered, serving as the bridge between liberals and conservatives. So, what was her strategy for centering the court and finding ways to build consensus and being the fifth vote in the 5-4 opinions? What was her approach to keep being the leader of the majority opinion?
Well, one thing she did was she having watched her mother and father, she learned not to get into stupid fights. And for instance, Scalia was always after her. Scalia publicly said one of her abortion cases, quote, cannot be taken seriously. That's a pretty harsh thing to say about a fellow justice. And it bothered Justice O'Connor, but she never responded publicly. And when her clerks would write little zingers, clerks draft opinions for Supreme Court justices, they would write these little zingers and she would take them out. And she made it clear to her clerks, she didn't want a lot of bad-mouthing of other justices in her. This is an interesting thing about her. She was a very social figure in Washington. I would say the most social justice in history. That's a very low bar, but she was she went out a lot. But she didn't gossip. In Washington, gossip is kind of the coin of the realm. You go out to dinner, gossip is what you do. But she didn't. And she had a great self-control. The men could get emotional and pick fights and all that, but she knew she couldn't afford it. Every once in a while, she'd stand up to them. I have to tell my one story from the state legislature. When she was majority leader in the state legislature, there was a guy named Tom Goodwin, who was the House Appropriations Committee chairman. So to pass the budget, she had to go work with him. And he was a drunk by 10 a.m. drunk. And he would go off on toots and take the budget with him. And so she finally confronted him for being a drunk. And he looked at her and said, if you were a man, I'd punch you in the nose. And she looked at him and said, if you were a man, you could. Yeah, that story, she'd like to tell that story. I like to tell that story. But really the thing about it, it's a one-off. She didn't do that kind of, she did every once in a while. She knew when to stand up to people. But far more often, she would walk away. She just wouldn't get into a dumb fight. And on the court, this is because you can get into these little petty feuds. Justice Brennan baited her a little bit in an early opinion. And, she just didn't take the bait. So this is very important to keeping comedy, of not getting, and she read books. She read The Antagonists about Frankfurter and Black. She read court history. She knew how bad it can get if you get into these rivalrous and caustic relationships. Easy to do. You're in your separate chambers. The clerks are gossiping and stoking the fires and fulminating against each other. And she just avoided all that.
Now, she did have her share of critics over the years while she was on the court. Among other things, they said she was, quote, not guided by consistent legal rules. Also said she had no agenda, per se, that she was a minimalist, that she was too results-oriented, and that she was, quote, a politician with legal training. Are all of these criticisms accurate?
Well, to a point. I mean, the last one, politician in judge's robes, that's what Scalia called her. So he was pretty caustic about her. It is true that judges, trial court judges, and lawyers could be frustrated by our opinions because there weren't clear rules that you could follow. It was very case by case, very fact specific, and not entirely predictable. So she has been, I think, fairly criticized for that. But she was on the, they talk about the debate between rules and standards. She was not on the rules side of it. What was it? Scalia said the rule of law is the law of rules. And he was a rule guy. You have to have rules. She was a standards person, sort of more general standards, reasonable man standards, giving the judges some wiggle room, and also the legislature some wiggle room. And so she was harder to pin down, but she found that to be a practical thing to do. And in most cases it was. But to answer your question, yes, she can be fairly criticized, and was.
Now, one of the great efforts over the last few decades at the Dallas Bar and State Bar of Texas has been this commitment to mentoring young lawyers. And your book goes into great detail about the close relationship, mentoring relationship she had with her clerks. She wanted diversity. She always had both liberals and conservative clerks. She gave them not only an apprenticeship in the law, but an apprenticeship in life. And so she mentored them both personally and professionally. So as you mentioned, you interviewed, over 90 of them for the book. So assume you're the composite voice of all those clerks. The question is, what was it like to clerk for Justice O'Connor?
Well, a little scary at first, because she had these beams of fire eyes that could bore right into you. And she was kind of no nonsense. Your average Supreme Court clerk is accustomed to being praised by adults. They've all been the head of the law review. They've been head, president of their class. They're used to adults telling them how great they are. And that was not her style. She was from a ranch where, things were tough, and if they didn't always work out, too bad. And if you did something well, okay. But so her clerks dealt with this by taking a Xerox of her hand and putting it on the wall underneath a sign that said, "If you want a pat on the back, lean here." And she was in on the joke. She, at least once that we know of, took a clerk and pushed him up against the wall. So she was a little scary, but the clerks, I think, discovered soon enough how much she cared about them. She didn't give them a legal quiz. She had her other clerks do that. She wanted to see whether she liked you and whether she thought you were going to get along with the other clerks. And she really cared about diversity. She hired the first disabled clerk, the first blind clerk. She hired a clerk who swum the English Channel, one who'd been an undercover CIA officer, a Vietnamese boat person, all over the place. Very, very diverse, very interesting. But what she mostly cared about was whether they were good people, whether they got along with each other, they were decent and honorable. And so her clerks were. And she cared about them personally. The joke was that she was a matchmaker. She was always trying to get him married. And she was pretty serious about this. I think, is Kathy Smalley here? Kathy was, hi Kathy. She tried to get Kathy married. She was serious. She was serious. She would try to get you boyfriends. There's a great Justice Souter's. She wanted to get Justice Souter married. Not only her clerks, but Justice Souter. And so she called up Bill Webster, Linda Webster. Bill Webster had been head of the CIA and head of the FBI, and she were friends. And she announced that she was bringing Justice Souter to dinner to Linda Webster. And why? Because she thought that Bill and Linda had a wonderful marriage, and she wanted to see Souter to see how great it was to be married. So she instructed Linda to act happy. And Linda turned to Bill and said, "Act happy." So she was, you can make fun of it, but she was deeply involved in the lives of her clerks. When they had kids, they were her grand clerks. And she stayed that way for many of them, all through their lives. And, they didn't always agree with her jurisprudence, but they all admired the hell out of her.
Mm-hmm. Now, you say that over her 24 years on the court, in time, her opinions moved to the left. What caused that?
Well, I asked Justice Stevens this question. I said, do you think that Justice O'Connor moved to the left during her time on the court? And he said, yes. And I said, really? So what moved him to the left? His answer was Justice Scalia. He was making a joke, but, not entirely. She did move a little. There are various standards and measurements, and they're a little bit hocus-pocusy, but yes. When she arrived on the court, she was more of a federalist. You may recall that in the early 80s, there was some hope in conservative circles that the Supreme Court, a conservative Supreme Court, would roll back the Warren Court, which had been too liberal and had taken too much power away from the states, from state courts and state legislatures, and invested it either in the federal government or in federal judges. And she was part of a movement with Justice Rehnquist, particularly in habeas cases, to take some of that power away from the federal judges and give it back to local judges. So yes, she was a conservative, but she wasn't predictably. And where women and children were involved, I'll give you one case that's revealing of her. It's called the soccer mom case. A woman was pulled over for taillights or what was it? Seatbelts. Pulled over for seatbelt. And the cop put her in jail. And so the issue before the Supreme Court was, can you be jailed for a misdemeanor? And Justice Souter, writing the opinion for the majority, said yes, because if you look at our constitutional history, there are plenty of examples of people being jailed for misdemeanors. She dissented because she got into the record and saw that the cop had humiliated this woman in front of her family. She had kids in the car, and her kids had been traumatized by it, and that really got to Justice O'Connor. And she also made the point that by permitting jailing people for misdemeanors, you're going to help police do racial profiling. It's going to increase the tension on racial profiling of putting young black men, for instance, in jail for driving with a broken taillight. So she was sensitive. That was a liberal thing that she did. She did it by getting into the record, by having her own feelings as a mother come into play, a little bit what it's like to be an outsider. She was informed by all that.
For my last question, ultimately, I mean, obviously she's still alive, but the question is, what's her legacy? And in the book, I was delighted to see that you compare her to Jackie Robinson, who when he broke the color barrier, he felt the weight of 10 million people on his back and felt like if he failed, it would be years before another African-American would be given a chance. Compare Jackie Robinson's situation to Sandra Day O'Connor.
Well, they both carried themselves with dignity. They knew that everybody was watching, and there was no room. I mean, I remember I was so struck by this, an Arizona legislator saying to me, the men up here, they could cry and get drunk and carry on and have stupid fights. Not her. She had to be self-disciplined in a way that the men did not have to be self-disciplined, and she was. And she always preserved her dignity no matter what. She could have fun. She was a cowgirl, she liked to drink. She liked, I remember she was once she liked to sing. The only thing she did badly was sing. And I remember watching her, she was with a famous tenor wailing out cowboy songs because she'd had a few pops. She could have fun. But she had an acute sense of her dignity, and she remained dignified. And she saw herself as very self-consciously as a bridge. She carried around a hokey poem about a bridge, about a pilgrim who comes to a canyon, and he builds a bridge, but then he doesn't cross it himself. It's a bridge so that other people can cross it. That's the way she was. She was as I mentioned, an unfeminist feminist. She was a traditional woman. She always wore dresses. She looked like a country club matron. She kind of was a country club matron. Her handicap was pretty good, 14, I think. So she was a transitional figure, but that was her legacy, as somebody who helped others get to the other side.
So we have time for some questions from the audience. Does anybody have a question for Evan about what we've been talking about? Yes, Josh. The question is, how is she doing today?
Not great. Justice O'Connor got, the diagnosis when you're her age is dementia, probably Alzheimer's. And her symptoms showed up in about 2012, 2013, very mild, but they got worse, of course. And today she's in an assisted living facility. She recognizes her family, and she may recognize people close to her. She knows what the lazy bee is, but that's about it.
Talk about, here's Osi.
Yeah, this is very important to her.
How did she spend her time after she left the court?
Yeah, I mean, I want to talk for a second about, she leaves the court. She's 75, but she's in great shape. But John, her husband, got Alzheimer's. And he'd had it for a while, and she cared for him as long as she possibly could. She would bring him to her chambers. He would sleep on a bench in her chambers. And finally, he couldn't. One of the symptoms of Alzheimer's can be that you can't sleep. They slept in the same bed, so if he couldn't sleep, she couldn't sleep. So finally, she retired. She says, he sacrificed for me. John O'Connor had been the big man in Phoenix in his law firm and the head of the Rotary and all that. When he came to Washington, he was not so successful. First law firm didn't work out. But she was always sensitive to that and sensitive to his ego. She always let him be the social lion at dinner and tell the funny stories. And she cared for him desperately. And so she said, when she left the court, she said, he sacrificed for me, now I'm going to sacrifice for him. And the tragedy was within 6 months, he couldn't recognize her. And as many of you know, he formed what they call a mistaken attachment with another woman. And she publicly said, this is great, he's happy now. Privately, of course, she was heartbroken. But typical of Sandra O'Connor, she would come in and John O'Connor would be sitting there holding hands with Kay, the woman's name was Kay, and she would come down and hold John's other hand. But, it was very tough for her, and she wanted to stay busy. And the way she stayed busy was her great cause in life was civics and civility. And the two are merged. You have to be civil to have a good civic life. And so she did a couple things. She really cared about judicial independence. She was a big crusader for that. And she was very bothered that school kids didn't know civics. Her corny joke was that kids know more about the Three Stooges than the three branches of government. And there's probably some truth to that. So she made it her business to educate school kids. And she started an organization called iCivics. And it's video games for middle schoolers on how a bill passes Congress or how a judge works. It reaches 6 million kids a year now. It's been very successful. And interestingly, she said her greatest legacy was not being the first woman on the Supreme Court, but starting iCivics. And her friend said, oh, come on, Sandra, you don't mean that. And she said, yes, I do, because it reached so many kids. And it's a successful thing, but this is a really meaningful legacy of hers in the last X years of her life.
Well, another important thing besides iCivics and her time on the court was she battled breast cancer.
She did, with her usual toughness. This is interesting, though. We had incredible papers, including John's diary, her husband's diary, every night for the entire, from 1981 to it peters out when he gets Alzheimer's in about 2002. But he has a couple of entries in there that were interesting. She gets breast cancer, and it turns out to be worse than she thought. It's in her ducts, and one of the doctors tells her she's got a 50-50 chance of living. And for a night, she actually loses confidence and wants to just die. No chemo, no radiation. She gives up. So uncharacteristic, so unlike her, so un-Sandra, but she's human. And so for a couple of nights, she gives up. But she rallies, as she always did. And of course, she doesn't miss an oral argument. She's back in her morning exercise class on the first Monday. She's out dancing within, I think, 2 weeks. She's very proud that her golf handicap doesn't go down. Total fighter. But everybody has a dark moment, and she did then.
Question? Well, yes, please.
Good. I mean, Justice Ginsburg arrives 12 years after she's been there. And she's glad to have company. Both of them told us that. Just the one thing, they finally built a ladies' room near the court conference room. They were different, though. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is a city girl, and O'Connor, obviously, she's in the Cowgirl Hall of Fame, a country girl. And so, interesting, Justice Ginsburg said that Justice O'Connor not once came to her chambers to talk about a case. I was kind of surprised by that. Justice Ginsburg is more liberal than Justice O'Connor. They worked together on some famous women's rights cases. In fact, shows you how selfless she is. You may recall the VMI case. I think it's called U.S. versus Virginia, or Virginia versus U.S. It was the case that said no more single-sex education in publicly supported institutions. And that case was initially assigned to Justice O'Connor. She said, no, I think Ruth should have this case. Now, that does not happen very much when a Supreme Court justice is assigned an opinion by the Chief Justice. Or
On a very important case.
On a very important case, and they say, no, no, somebody else should have this. And Justice Ginsburg told us, I loved her for that. I loved her for that. She also said, this is a funny story, Justice O'Connor's messenger, Romeo Cruz, told us that Justice Ginsburg rear-ended Justice O'Connor's car twice in the garage. The first time he said was a hit and run. And so when Ossie and I were seeing Justice Ginsburg, we saved this question for last. But we said, is it really true that you crashed into Justice O'Connor's car in the garage? And she said, yes, it's true. She said, I've never driven again. And she explained that she ran into Justice O'Connor's car because she was trying to avoid hitting Justice Scalia's car.
Well, Evan, thanks so much. You've been terrific. Don't you, Phil? Thank you.